In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, a place where the sun baked the land until it cracked and bled dust, a single act of mercy could cost you everything. For Clara May Thompson, a woman whose world was confined to a small, isolated homestead, compassion was a language she knew better than fear. When she found him a ghost of a man, an Apache warrior, bleeding his life into the parched earth, she made a choice. She chose to save a life the world told her to despise. She never imagined that her secret act of kindness would be repaid with a terrifying salvation, that the man she healed in the shadows would one day return with 100 warriors at his back, not to thank her, but to claim her. This is the story of a debt paid in the most stunning way imaginable, a story of how a saved life returned to change hers forever. The wind was a malicious thing in the autumn of 1878. It didn't just blow across the Sulphur Springs Valley. It clawed, scoured, and shrieked, peeling the topsoil from the ground and flinging it into a suffocating rust-colored haze. From the small window of her family's sod-roofed cabin, Clara May Thompson watched the world disappear. The distant Dragoon Mountains, usually a jagged purple sentinel against the sky, were gone, swallowed by the maelstrom. God Almighty's own breath, her father Silas rasped from his chair by the cold hearth. His voice was as dry as the land itself, cracked and weathered by 60 years of hard living. He was a good man, a man of simple convictions. You work the land, you fear the Lord, and you trust no one whose skin is a different shade than your own. Especially not the Apache. The Chiricahua, the Shiz-Inde, as they called themselves, were a constant, unspoken terror. They were ghosts in the canyons, masters of the unforgiving landscape. Stories told in hushed tones at the dusty outpost of Fort Bowie spoke of their ferocity of raids and retribution. To Silas and to most settlers, they were a force of nature to be feared, and if possible, eradicated. Clara May, however, held a different view, one she kept locked away like a precious stone. Her late mother, a woman who believed in the healing power of herbs and the inherent good in all living things, had taught her that hate was a poison you drank yourself. Every creature bleeds the same color, Clara, she used to say, while grinding creosote leaves into a poultice. Don't you forget it. Clara hadn't forgotten. At 22, she was a woman shaped by the land's harshness, but softened by her mother's memory. Her hands were calloused from hauling water and tending their meager garden, but they were also gentle-skilled in setting a bone or stitching a wound. The dust storm raged for 2 days. When it finally broke, the world was remade in sepia and silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and ozone, a fragile truce between the sky and the ground. It was on the 3rd morning, while checking the line of rabbit snares near the dry creek bed, that she found him. At first she thought he was a piece of driftwood, a tangle of buckskin and black hair, half buried in the newly settled dust. Then she saw the crimson stain, a dark, ugly flower, blooming on the earth around him. Her breath caught in her throat. An Apache. He was sprawled on his stomach, a rifle lying uselessly a few feet away. His back was a mess of torn flesh and dried blood, a wound that looked like it had been made by a cavalry saber, a deep, vicious gash that had festered. He was thin, terrifyingly, so his ribs stark beneath his skin. But he was alive. A shallow, rattling breath was the only proof. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Her father's warnings, the stories, the ingrained caution of a lifetime, it all screamed at her to turn back. Leave him. He was the enemy. Finding him here on their land was a death sentence for them both, if anyone found out. The cavalry would call them sympathizers, and his own people, if they found him, might not be any kinder. She took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind raced. She could walk away. By nightfall, the coyotes would have done their work. No one would ever know. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But then the man groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure agony. His head shifted slightly, and for a moment his profile was visible against the reddish dirt. It wasn't the face of a monster from the campfire stories. It was the face of a man in his final desperate moments. High cheekbones, a strong jaw clenched in pain, and a fringe of sweat-soaked black hair plastered to his forehead. Her mother's voice whispered in her memory, "Every creature bleeds the same color." Clara May made her choice. It was a reckless, foolish, and possibly fatal one, but it was hers. With strength born of adrenaline, she knelt beside him. The wound was worse up close, inflamed and angry. He would die of infection if the blood loss hadn't already doomed him. She couldn't possibly move him to the cabin. Silas would kill him on sight. There was only one place. About 100 yards up the creek bed was a small cave, little more than an overhang in the rock face, concealed by a thicket of hardy mesquite. Her father called it the foxhole. It was where they stored extra tools during planting season. She grabbed the man under his arms. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. He smelled of sweat blood and the dust of the earth he was dying on. She dragged him her boots, slipping in the loose soil, her muscles screaming in protest. Every rustle of a bush, every caw of a distant raven sent a fresh wave of panic through her. He was unconscious, or close to it, his body limp as she hauled him into the cool darkness of the small cave. She ran back to the cabin, her mind a whirlwind of lies and half-truths. She told Silas she was going to clear the debris from the well. Inside, she gathered what she needed, her mother's worn wooden box of herbs, clean rags, a skin of water, and a small knife she heated in the kitchen fire until the tip glowed orange. She wrapped it all in a spare blanket, her hands trembling. Returning to the cave felt like stepping into another life. The warrior lay where she had left him, a dark shape in the gloom. Kneeling, she whispered more to herself than to him. "Lord, forgive me if this is wrong, but leaving a man to die feels a damn sight wronger." With the sterilized knife, she began the gruesome work of cleaning the wound, cutting away the dead infected tissue. The man jerked and cried out a raw sound of agony that tore at her heart. His eyes, dark and delirious with fever, flew open and fixed on her. They were filled with a potent mixture of hate and confusion. He tried to move to fight, but he was too weak. "Be still," she murmured, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm trying to help you." He couldn't understand her words, but he seemed to understand the intent in her touch. His body went rigid, but he stopped struggling. She worked quickly, her mother's lessons flowing back to her. She packed the cleaned wound with a poultice of yarrow to stop the bleeding and crushed juniper leaves to fight the sickness. She bound it tightly with clean rags. She dribbled water onto his cracked lips, watching his throat work as he swallowed. For hours she sat with him, replacing the cool, damp cloth on his forehead, watching the fever wage its war within him. As dusk fell, painting the cave entrance in hues of orange and purple, she knew she had crossed a line. She was hiding an Apache warrior on her father's land, nursing the very man he considered his mortal enemy. This secret was now a living, breathing thing, and she had no idea if it would save her or be the cause of her ruin. The next few days blurred into a grueling routine of deception and care. Clara May lived a double life, her hours divided between the familiar chores of the homestead and the clandestine world of the cave. She would rise before dawn, finish her work with a frantic energy that puzzled Silas, and then slip away, her pockets filled with stolen morsels of jerky and bread, a skin of fresh water hidden under her shawl. Silas grew suspicious. "You're jumpy as a flea on a hot griddle, girl," he grumbled one evening, his eyes narrowed as he watched her stare out the window towards the creek bed. "What's got you so spooked?" "Just the storm." She lied, her heart thumping. "It left me on edge." In the cave, the warrior whose name she still didn't know drifted in and out of consciousness. The fever was a relentless beast, shaking his body with violent tremors and pulling delirious Apache words from his lips. In those moments he was a different person, not the stoic, hostile man whose eyes burned with suspicion when he was lucid, but a vulnerable boy calling for his mother, his brother, his people. Clara May wiped his brow, listened to the strange musical cadence of his language, and felt a profound and dangerous sense of connection. She learned the landscape of his face, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the proud arch of his nose, the way his jaw tensed even in sleep. He was a man built of resilience, his body a testament to a life of hardship and strength. Slowly, miraculously, her ministrations began to work. The angry red of the wound began to fade, the fever broke, and the clarity returned to his dark eyes. The first time he was truly lucid, he watched her with an unnerving intensity. He said nothing as she changed his dressing, his gaze tracking her every movement. It wasn't a look of gratitude. It was the watchful, calculating stare of a trapped wolf. She was his captor as much as his savior. "Water, wah," she offered, holding out the water skin. He stared at it for a long moment before giving a short, sharp nod. He drank deeply, his eyes never leaving hers. Their communication was a pantomime of gestures and single words. "Food," she would say, holding up a piece of dried meat. He would nod. She pointed to herself. "Clara." He merely watched, his expression unreadable. He offered no name in return. One afternoon, a week after she found him, he was sitting up his back against the cool stone of the cave wall. He was testing the strength in his arms, his face a mask of concentration. When she entered, he looked at her, and then gestured to the neat bandage on his back. He spoke a single word in his tongue, his voice a low rasp. She shook her head. "I don't understand." He pointed to the wound, then touched his chest over his heart. Then he pointed at her. The gesture was clear. "You did this for me." It was the first glimmer of acknowledgement, a tiny seed of trust planted in barren ground. The trust, however, was about to be shattered. That same evening, Silas, his patience worn thin by Clara May's increasingly erratic behavior, decided to follow her. He had seen her sneaking towards the creek bed, too many times had noticed the missing food and the extra laundry. His mind, conditioned by the fears of the frontier, had already leapt to the worst conclusion: she was meeting someone, a man, and in this lawless land that could mean only trouble. Clara May was in the cave, showing the warrior how to properly retie his bandage when the shadow fell across the entrance. She looked up, her blood turning to ice. Silas stood there, his face a storm cloud of disbelief and rage. In his hand, he held his old, reliable Winchester rifle. "Get away from him, Clara," Silas ordered, his voice dangerously low. The warrior was on his feet in an instant, his body tensing despite his weakness. He moved to place himself partially in front of Clara May, a protective gesture that was as shocking as it was instinctive. "Father, no, it's not what you think," she pleaded, stepping out from behind the warrior. "He was hurt. Dying. I was just helping him." "Helping him?" Silas's voice cracked with fury. "That's an Apache. They're murderers and thieves. They killed the Millers last spring, burned their whole ranch to the ground. Have you forgotten that he'd cut your throat for a mouthful of water if he had the strength?" "He's just a man, Father. He was wounded and left for dead." "He's the enemy," Silas roared, raising the rifle. Its dark bore was aimed squarely at the warrior's chest. "Step aside, Clara May. I'm ending this right now." The cave was silent, save for the ragged sound of their breathing. The warrior stood his ground, his dark eyes locked on Silas, unflinching in the face of death. He was weak, unarmed, but he stood with the pride of a king. In that terrible stretched moment, Clara May saw the path her life was about to take. If she stepped aside, she would be her father's daughter, again safe and obedient. But she would have betrayed the very core of her being her mother's most sacred lesson. She would be letting fear win. She didn't step aside. Instead, she moved directly in front of the warrior, shielding him with her own body. She spread her arms, her small frame, a fragile barrier against the rifle. "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "If you're going to shoot him, you'll have to shoot me first." Silas stared at her, his face a canvas of shock, betrayal, and a deep, wounded love. He saw not a foolish girl, but a woman he didn't recognize, a woman of terrifying conviction. The rifle trembled in his hands. The man he was aiming at was a nameless, faceless enemy. But the person standing in his way was his daughter, his only child, the last piece of his beloved wife he had left in the world. His shoulders slumped. The fire in his eyes died, replaced by a weary, defeated sadness. Slowly, painfully, he lowered the Winchester. "God help us," he whispered, the words lost in the vast, indifferent silence of the Arizona Territory. "God help us all." The standoff was over, but nothing was the same. The secret was out, a gaping wound in the heart of their family. And in the shadows of the cave, the Apache warrior watched the exchange, his dark eyes missing nothing. He had just seen this strange white woman, his healer, risk her life for his. A debt had been incurred, and in his world, a debt of that magnitude could only be repaid in one way, with a life for a life. The uneasy truce in the Thompson household was as fragile as a desert mirage. Silas did not speak of the warrior again, but his silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He looked at Clara May with eyes full of hurt and confusion, his trust in her fractured. He refused to go near the creek bed, effectively pretending the cave and its occupant didn't exist. Yet every evening, Clara May would find a small portion of Silas's own dinner set aside on the counter, a silent, grudging concession that he would not let his daughter's charge starve. The warrior who Clara May now knew was named Kalen began to heal rapidly. His strength returned, the gauntness in his face replaced by the sharp, defined lines of a man in his prime. He began to speak, more pointing at objects and waiting for her to supply the English word. Water. Stone. Sky. In return, he would offer the Apache word, his voice a low rumble. It was a slow, careful dance of communication. He watched her constantly, not with the suspicion of before, but with a deep, penetrating curiosity. He watched her mend her father's shirt, her fingers nimble with the needle. He watched her knead dough, her brow furrowed in concentration. He was learning her, studying her in a way that was both unsettling and profoundly intimate. But as one threat inside her home began to recede, another far more dangerous one grew on the horizon. His name was Jedediah Kane. Kane was a rancher whose property bordered the Thompsons' small homestead. He was a big man with a florid face and small, greedy eyes that missed nothing. He had been buying up land all over the valley, consolidating his power with a ruthlessness that made folks nervous. He had his sights set on the Thompson place, not for its size, but for the one thing it had that his vast tracts of land didn't a reliable spring the very source of the creek that ran through their property? He had made Silas offers before, all of which had been curtly refused. One sweltering afternoon, Cain rode up to the cabin, his massive frame perched atop a fine black stallion. He didn't dismount, a calculated gesture of disrespect. "Silas!" He boomed, his voice carrying on the still air. "Still trying to scratch a living out of this dust bowl." Silas stepped onto the porch, his face grim. "It's our living, Cain, and it ain't for sale." "Everything's for sale, old man." Cain sneered. His eyes shifted to Clara May, who stood in the doorway, and his gaze lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "A pretty thing like your daughter shouldn't be wasting away out here. Sell to me. You could both move to Tucson live comfortably." I said no. Silas said, his voice hard as ironwood. Cain's smile was thin and cruel. "The Apache have been restless. Raiding parties seen up near the Chiricahuas. A lone old man and his daughter. It's a dangerous place to be without neighbors to watch your back." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. From the concealed mouth of the cave, Kalen watched the exchange. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood the language of power and intimidation. He saw the way Cain looked at Clara May, the predatory hunger in his eyes. He saw the fear and defiance warring on Silas's face. He recognized Cain for what he was, a vulture, circling, waiting for the weak to fall. The danger to Clara May was not just from his people, it was from her own. Cain's visits became more frequent, his intimidation more overt. One day, a section of their fence was torn down, their few cattle scattered. Another time, the bucket to their well was missing, forcing Clara May to haul water from the spring for hours. Silas knew it was Cain's work, but there was no proof and no one to turn to. The local sheriff was 100 miles and a week's ride away, and likely in Cain's pocket anyway. Clara May's anxiety grew. She felt trapped between her silent, disapproving father and the encroaching menace of Jedediah Cain. The cave became her only sanctuary. In Calen's quiet presence, she found a strange sense of peace. He was a calming force, a silent sentinel who simply listened as she sometimes spoke her fears aloud. "He wants our water," she told Calen one afternoon, gesturing vaguely in the direction of Cain's ranch. "He'll do anything to get it." Calen listened, his expression somber. He picked up a smooth, flat stone, and using the sharp edge of another began to scratch a picture into its surface. He drew a mountain, a spring flowing from it. Then he drew a large, ugly bird, a vulture circling overhead. Finally, he drew a small, sturdy-looking plant growing beside the spring. He looked at Clara May, his meaning clear. Cain was the vulture. She and her father were the plant, clinging to the source of life. It was a startling moment of understanding. He saw her situation more clearly than anyone. He understood that her world was just as dangerous as his, governed by the same brutal laws of predator and prey. That evening he knew he could not stay. He was almost fully healed, and his presence was putting her and Silas in more danger than ever. If Cain or his men were to discover him, it would be the perfect excuse to destroy the Thompsons and seize their land. Furthermore, a deep sense of duty called to him. His people would think him dead. He had responsibilities, a life he had to return to. But leaving felt like its own kind of betrayal. He owed this woman a debt that could never be repaid with a simple thank you. He owed her his life. As he watched her from the shadows of the cave, her face etched with worry, as she looked out over the land, he knew that his departure would not be the end of their story. It would only be the beginning. He had to leave to protect her now, but he would have to return to save her later. A plan began to form in his mind, a plan born of Apache custom honor and a feeling for her, that he did not yet have a name for. It was a bold, terrifying plan that would shatter her world to save it. The night Kaelin chose to leave a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, casting the landscape in pale, ghostly light. Clara May had brought him his usual meal, but a heavy silence hung between them. He was dressed in the mended buckskins, his movements sure and strong. The weakness that had clung to him for weeks was gone, replaced by a potent, coiled energy. He stood and faced her, his height and presence filling the small cave. For the first time she saw him not as a patient or a secret, but as he truly was, a Chiricahua warrior, a man forged by a world she could barely imagine. "I go now," he said, his English still halting, but the meaning absolute. Clara May's heart clenched. She had known this moment was coming, had even prayed for it in her most fearful moments. But now that it was here, a profound sense of loss washed over her. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He gestured to the southeast, towards the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. "My people." He reached out not to touch her, but to take the small leather pouch of herbs that hung from her belt. It was the one she used for healing, the one that held the yarrow and juniper that had saved his life. He held it for a moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light, then tied it securely to his own belt. It was a keepsake, a token. A piece of her he was taking with him. Then he did something that stunned her. He reached up and, with a sharp tug, pulled a single long strand of his own jet-black hair. He held it out to her. In his culture, it was a gesture of immense significance, a promise, a piece of his spirit given freely. Clara May, of course, understood none of this. To her, it was just a strange, intimate act. She took the strand of hair, its texture coarse and vital, in her palm. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "You are Shikany," he said the Apache word soft on his tongue. He tapped his chest. "In here." He then pointed at her. "I come back." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as certain as the rising of the sun. Before she could respond, before she could ask what the word meant or what his promise implied, he turned and slipped out of the cave. He moved with a supernatural silence, melting into the moon-drenched shadows and disappearing as if he had never been there at all. Clara May stood alone, the strand of black hair clutched in her hand. The cave felt cavernously empty. The world felt dangerous again. In the days that followed, an oppressive quiet settled over the homestead. Silas, noticing Kaelin's absence, did not ask questions, but the tension between him and Clara May slowly eased, replaced by a shared, unspoken vulnerability. They were alone again, two small figures against a vast and hostile landscape. Jedediah Kane, however, was not a man to be patient. He had seen Kaelin leave. One of his ranch hands, scouting the Thompson property line, had caught a glimpse of the Apache warrior slipping away in the pre-dawn light. For Kane, this was not a relief. It was an opportunity. The story was perfect, easily twisted to his advantage. The Thompsons weren't just stubborn homesteaders. They were Indian sympathizers, traitors to their own kind. His campaign of terror escalated. It was no longer about intimidation. It was about annihilation. One night, their small chicken coop was set ablaze, the frantic cries of the birds, a horrifying sound in the darkness. A few days later, their only mule was found dead by the spring, a bullet hole in its side. Silas Thompson, though old, was not a man to be broken easily. His face became a mask of grim determination. "He's trying to starve us out, Clara," he said one evening, cleaning his Winchester with methodical, angry movements. "He wants us to run. We're not running." The final confrontation came a week after Kaelin's departure. The sun was setting, bleeding across the horizon in shades of fire and regret. 3 men rode onto their property, led by Jedediah Cain. They were not here to talk. They carried rifles, and their faces were hard with violent intent. "Last chance! Silas!" Cain yelled, his voice echoing in the twilight. "Sign the deed over to me, and I'll let you and the girl walk away with your lives. Refuse, and I'll burn this place to the ground with you in it." Silas walked out, onto the porch, his own rifle in his hand. He was old and outnumbered, but he stood tall. "Get off my land, Jedediah." Clara May watched in horror from the window, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm of terror. This was it. The end of everything. "Wrong answer, old man." Cain sneered and raised his rifle. What happened next was a blur of smoke and thunder. Silas got off one shot, the bullet tearing a chunk of wood from Cain's saddle horn, but the other 2 men fired simultaneously. The impact threw Silas backward against the cabin door, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He slid to the ground, his eyes wide with shock, the Winchester clattering from his grasp. "Father!" Clara May screamed a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. She ran to the door, oblivious to the danger, and fell to her knees beside him. His breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. He tried to speak, but only a trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. He squeezed her hand, his eyes finding hers one last time, and then the light in them went out. A profound, chilling emptiness enveloped her. She was alone, truly and utterly alone. Through a haze of grief and shock, she heard Cain's cruel laughter. "A shame," he said without a trace of remorse. He was a stubborn fool. Now the girl. Bring her. She can sign the deed. She'll be useful back at the ranch. One of his men, a lanky cowboy named Peterson, dismounted and started towards her, a greasy smile on his face. Clara May scrambled backward, her hands scrabbling for the fallen rifle. It was too far. He was almost upon her, his shadow falling over her, blocking out the last of the dying light. She closed her eyes, a single tear cutting a path through the grime on her cheek. This was the end. A life of quiet compassion and simple faith ending in brutality and darkness. She thought of her mother, of her father, and strangely of the warrior whose life she had saved. "I come back," he had promised. It was a fool's hope. Just as Peterson's hand was about to close around her arm, a sound stopped him. It was a sound that did not belong to the coming night, a sound that froze the blood in their veins. It started as a low, chilling cry, a single human voice, and was answered by another and another, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with it. It was the high, ululating war cry of the Chiricahua Apache. Cain and his men froze their heads, snapping up towards the ridge overlooking the homestead. The last rays of the sun glinted off something on the crest of the hill, and then they saw them. Silhouetted against the blood-red sky were riders. Not 1 or 2, but dozens, 100, maybe more. An army of silent, painted warriors sitting on their ponies, armed with rifles and lances, watching the scene below with the cold patience of death itself. And at their head, sitting on a powerful bay warhorse, was Kaelin. The world seemed to hold its breath. The chirping of crickets ceased, the wind died, and the only sound was the frantic pounding of Clara May's own heart. Kaelin was a terrifying spectre against the dying sun. He was not the wounded man she had nursed in the cave. He wore a simple breechcloth and moccasins, his torso and face streaked with black and white paint that gave him the appearance of a spirit of vengeance. A hawk feather was tied in his long black hair, and in his hand he held not a rifle but a stone-headed war club. He looked every bit the war chief her father had always feared. Jedediah Kane's face, moments before, flush with triumph, had turned a pasty white. His bravado evaporated like a drop of water on a hot skillet. He and his 2 men were caught exposed in the open, with a literal army of Apache warriors looking down on them. Slowly, deliberately, Kalen urged his horse forward, descending the ridge. His warriors did not follow. They remained on the crest, a silent, menacing promise of the violence that could be unleashed. Kalen rode not with speed, but with an unhurried, regal grace that was more intimidating than any charge. He stopped his horse a dozen yards from Kane, his dark eyes sweeping over the scene: Silas's body, the grief-stricken Clara May, and the 3 stunned settlers. His gaze finally settled on Kane. He spoke not in English, but in the guttural, powerful language of the Apache. The words were sharp, accusatory. He pointed at Silas's body with his war club, then at Clara May. Kane, fumbling for his pistol, found his hand shaking too badly to draw it. We have no quarrel with you," he stammered, his voice thin with terror. "This is settler business." Kalen's lips curled into a sneer of contempt. He understood more English than Kane could ever imagine. He nudged his horse forward until he was towering over the rancher. He spoke again in Apache, then switched to the broken English he had learned from Clara May, the words coming out cold, and clipped each one a shard of ice. "Her land," he said, gesturing to Clara May. "Her father." He pointed the club at Kane. "You, vulture." He used the word she had taught him, and hearing it now in this context sent a shiver down her spine. He then looked directly at Clara May, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. He saw the tears on her face, the body of her father at her feet. He looked back at Kane, and the fury in his eyes was absolute. Without another word, he swung his horse around and let out a sharp cry. In perfect, terrifying unison, 50 warriors on the ridge raised their rifles to their shoulders, the setting sun glinting off the long steel barrels. The message was unequivocal. Kane's man, Peterson, threw his rifle to the ground. "We're leaving!" he shrieked, scrambling back onto his horse. The other man did the same. Kane hesitated for only a moment, his greedy eyes darting from the warriors to the cabin, the prize he had just lost. But fear won out over greed. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men close behind, not daring to look back. They rode as if the devil himself were on their tails. Silence descended once more. The warriors on the ridge lowered their rifles, but remained watching. Kalen dismounted and walked towards Clara May. His movements were fluid, predatory. He stopped before her, looking down at the body of her father. A flicker of something regret, perhaps, crossed his face. He knew this man had hated him, had wanted him dead. But he was Clara May's father. Clara May looked up at him through a blur of tears, a storm of conflicting emotions raging within her. Relief so profound it made her weak, mingled with terror. He had saved her. He had kept his promise. But the man standing before her was a stranger, a painted warrior with an army at his back. He's gone," she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at Silas. Kalen knelt not beside her, but a respectful distance away. He reached out and placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, a gesture of finality, of acknowledgement. Then he rose and turned his full attention to her. "They will come back," he said, his voice low and certain, "with soldiers. They will say you helped us. They will say you are a traitor. Your world is gone." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about? You saved me. You drove them off." "I saved you," he agreed, his eyes boring into hers. "And now I save you again." He took a step closer. Several of his warriors, including a stern-faced man with a cruel scar on his cheek, had descended the ridge and now stood behind him. They watched her with hard, unreadable eyes. "What are you going to do?" she asked, a new kind of fear beginning to bloom in her chest, cold and sickening. Kaelin reached down and with surprising gentleness took her arm, pulling her to her feet. His grip was like iron. "A life for a life," he said, the words echoing the core of his belief system. "You saved my life. Now I claim yours. It is the law of my people. It is the only way to give you protection. My protection." Clara May's mind reeled. "Claim me. What does that mean?" "You are mine now," he stated simply, as if explaining the weather. "You will be my wife. You will come with us. In my wickiup, under the protection of my name, no white man will dare touch you. No Apache will harm you. This is the way." The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't salvation. This was a capture. Her relief curdled into horror. He hadn't just saved her from Cain. He had taken her from her life, from everything she had ever known. She had been a pawn in Cain's game, and now she was a prize in Kaelin's. "No!" she gasped, pulling against his grip. "No, you can't. This is my home." "Your home is a grave," he said, his voice devoid of pity, gesturing to her father. He pulled her firmly towards his horse. "Your home is with me now." The other warriors moved to surround them. The scarred one, Nikan, grabbed her other arm. There was no escape. She was a prisoner, her fate decided, by a custom she didn't understand, and a man she thought she knew, but who was now a terrifying enigma. They lifted her onto Kaelin's horse, placing her in front of him. He swung up behind her, his body a hard, unyielding wall at her back. She was trapped. As he spurred the horse forward, leading his war party away from the smouldering ruin of her life, Clara May looked back one last time at the cabin at the body of her father, lying alone in the dust. She had saved a dying warrior out of compassion, and he had returned with an army to claim her as his bride. It was not a rescue. It was an abduction, a terrifying, unwanted salvation that was dragging her into the heart of a world from which she might never return. The tears that streamed down her face were no longer tears of grief but of despair. The journey into the Dragoon Mountains was a nightmare of disorientation and fear. Clara May was held fast in front of Kaelin, the rhythmic movement of the horse, a jarring reminder of her captivity. The silent column of warriors moved with a speed and efficiency that was breathtaking, navigating treacherous moonlit canyons and rocky inclines as if they were flat plains. The world she knew, the familiar shapes of the mesas, the scent of the creosote bushes, vanished, replaced by a dark alien landscape of stone and shadow. They rode through the night, stopping only once for a brief rest, where Clara May was given water and dried meat which she refused. The Apache warriors ignored her, their faces impassive masks. The one called Nikan, the warrior with the scarred cheek, watched her with open hostility. To him, she was a white eye, a creature of the enemy, and he made no effort to hide his contempt. Just before dawn, they arrived at the Apache stronghold. It was not a camp of teepees, as she might have imagined, but a hidden village, a rancheria tucked away in a high, protected valley, naturally fortified by sheer rock walls. Dozens of dome-shaped dwellings, or wickiups made of bent branches and covered in hides, were scattered amongst the rocks and scrub oak. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the unfamiliar scent of wild herbs. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Women stopped their work, children paused their games, and old men looked up from their quiet conversations. 100 pairs of dark eyes fixed on her, the strange white woman in a torn dress riding with their war chief. The stares were not kind. They were a mixture of intense curiosity, deep suspicion, and in some faces, outright hatred. Kaelin dismounted and lifted her down, his grip firm on her arm. He led her through the center of the rancheria, towards the largest wickiup, which stood on a slightly elevated piece of ground. A murmur followed them, a wave of whispers, in a language she could not comprehend. She felt like a specimen on display, her shame and fear a heavy cloak. Inside the wickiup was larger than it looked, the air cool and dark. A small fire smouldered in the center, the smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. Animal pelts covered the ground, and weapons a bow, a quiver of arrows, a lance leaned against the curved walls. This was his home, her prison. An old woman with a face like a wrinkled map and eyes as bright and sharp as a hawk's was waiting for them. She looked at Clara May, then at Kaelin, and began to speak rapidly in Apache. Kaelin responded in a low, respectful tone. It was an argument. The old woman, his mother, Clara May surmised, gestured at Clara May with a dismissive flick of her wrist. Kaelin shook his head, his voice firm, insistent. Finally, the old woman fell silent. Her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Kaelin turned to Clara May. "This is Tiana, my mother," he said. "You will stay here. You will be safe." "Safe." Clara May's voice was hoarse with emotion. "I'm your prisoner." "You are my intended," he corrected her, the distinction lost on her. "It is different. Tiana will give you clothes, food. You will learn our ways." "I don't want to learn your ways. I want to go home." A flicker of something frustration, perhaps pain, crossed his face. "I told you. Your home is a grave. Your people think you are a captive or a traitor. Either way, they will hang you. Here you are, Kaelin's woman. It is the highest protection I can offer. I have paid the debt. I have saved your life." He turned and left without another word, leaving her alone with the stony-faced Tiana. The old woman looked her up and down with disdain, then threw a bundle of soft buckskin, a woman's dress, at her feet. The message was clear. Shed your old life, your old self. The days that followed were the most difficult of Clara May's life. She was an outcast, an object of scorn and suspicion. The women of the tribe, led by Tiana, gave her the hardest, most menial tasks, scraping animal hides, until her hands were raw, grinding corn for hours on a rough stone slab, hauling heavy skins of water from the spring. They spoke to her only in commands, their words sharp and unwelcoming. Nikan and the other warriors who resented her presence would watch her work, their eyes full of malice. They saw her as a weakness, a contamination Kaelin had brought into their midst. Clara May resisted. At first, she refused to work, sitting in sullen silence. But hunger was a great motivator, and Tiana made it clear that those who did not contribute did not eat. Slowly, reluctantly, she began to perform the tasks, her body aching with the unaccustomed labor. She was clumsy, inept, and the other women's mocking laughter was a constant source of humiliation. Kaelin was a distant figure. As a war chief, he was consumed by his duties, leading patrols, settling disputes, planning for the tribe's defense. She would see him from afar, a figure of authority and power, and feel a bitter resentment. He had saved her, only to condemn her to this life of servitude and loneliness. He would come to the wickiup late at night, long after she had cried herself, to sleep on a pile of furs on the far side of the fire, and he would be gone before she awoke. They lived in the same space, but were worlds apart. Yet amidst the hardship, there were flickers of understanding. She began to see the Chiricahua not as the savage monsters of settler stories, but as a people struggling to survive. She saw the genuine affection between families, the deep respect they had for their elders, their intimate connection to the land that sustained them. She saw the ever-present fear in their eyes, the fear of the Inda, the white man who was relentlessly hunting them and stealing their world. Her breakthrough came not through strength, but through her own unique skill. One of the children, a small boy named Chaitan, fell from a rock and broke his arm, a nasty compound fracture. The tribe's medicine man did his best with chants and prayers, but the wound was festering, the boy screaming with fever. Clara May watched her healer's instincts overriding her fear and misery. She saw the boy's terrified mother, saw the pain in his eyes, and knew she could help. She approached the medicine man, a wrinkled old man named Dasoda, and through a series of gestures tried to explain. He was suspicious, but the boy's worsening condition made him desperate. With Tiana and Kaelin watching from a distance, Clara May went to work. She sent some of the women to find the plants she recognized from her own land yarrow and a type of wild sage. She cleaned the wound carefully, set the bone, and fashioned a splint from straight branches and strips of hide. She made a poultice to draw out the infection and brewed a tea from willow bark to fight the fever. For 2 days and nights, she sat by the boy's side, barely sleeping, coaxing him to drink, changing his dressings. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. The swelling in his arm had gone down. The boy, Chaitan, looked at her with clear, grateful eyes. His mother wept and embraced her. Something shifted in the rancheria that day. The women's stares were no longer entirely hostile. They began to speak to her not just in commands, but in simple words, teaching her the names for things in their language. Dasoda the medicine man began to show her the herbs of the mountains, discovering with grudging respect that this white woman knew as much of the healing arts as he did. She was no longer just the war chief's captive. She was the healer, a woman of value. That night, Kaelin came to the wickiup while she was still awake. He sat across the fire from her, watching her for a long time. "You have a strong spirit," he said finally. "Shikan. What does that word mean?" She asked the question she had been holding on to for weeks. "You said it to me the night you left." He looked into the fire, his face softened by the flickering light. "Shikan," he repeated softly. "It means my heart, my soul, my purpose." Clara May stared at him, stunned into silence. All this time she had seen his actions as those of a conqueror claiming his prize. Now she was forced to see them through a different lens. He had not claimed her as property. He had bound her to his very being the only way he knew how to honor the woman who had saved his life, and to give her the ultimate protection of his name and his heart. The line between captor and savior blurred, leaving her more confused than ever. She was the bride of the Shirakawa, but for the first time, she began to wonder what that truly meant. Of course. Here is a rewritten version of Part 7 condensed to approximately 300 words. The fragile piece shattered when Kaelin's scouts reported a column of blue-coated soldiers advancing, led by Jedediah Kane and a determined captain, Marcus Thorne. Vengeance was coming. In the tribe's war council, the scarred warrior, Nikan, pointed at Clara May, his voice thick with accusation. "She is a curse. This white-eye witch has led them to us." But the woman who stepped forward was not the frightened captive he remembered. "You are wrong," Clara May declared, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "Kane is the curse, and I know how to fight him. I know his greed. I know the soldier's ways." She offered her knowledge not as a prisoner, but as an ally, and Kaelin, his eyes filled with a fierce pride, accepted her counsel. The ambush in the narrow canyon was devastatingly effective. Using Clara May's insights, the warriors triggered a rock slide, trapping the cavalry in a storm of arrows and bullets. While she tended to the Apache wounded in a hidden cave, her hand steady and sure, Kaelin sought out his true enemy. The final brutal confrontation ended with Jedediah Cain, lifeless in the dust, his greed forever extinguished. After the battle, Kaelin came to her, his face streaked with the grime of victory. "You fought for the people," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You have the heart of a Chiricahua." He offered her a choice, one he had not given her before. "The way back to your world is open. I will not hold you." He paused, his gaze intense. "Or you can stay, as my wife, my partner." Clara May looked at the mountains, at the resilient faces around her, and at the man who had claimed her only to finally set her free. She knew where she belonged. "My home is with you," she answered, her voice certain. "Shikan, my heart." In the heart of the Arizona Territory, she was no longer a captive, but a queen. And so the story of Clara May Thompson and the Apache war chief Kaelin became a whispered legend in the Arizona Territory. She was not the tragic captive of the Army's official reports, but a woman who found her true self in the heart of a world she was supposed to fear. Theirs was a love born, not of gentle courtship, but forged in fire blood and a profound debt of life and honor. Together they faced the ever-encroaching world, two people from different universes, who built a sanctuary not of wood or stone, but of mutual respect and a fierce, unyielding devotion. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest salvation comes in the most terrifying disguise, and that the deepest connections are often found across the most impossible divides. If this story of unlikely love and survival in the Old West captured your imagination, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with a friend who loves epic dramas. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales of history, romance, and the untamed human spirit. Thank you for listening.